Hello and welcome to Discovering Me Collecting Information. I'm Kendel St. John and I'm here with Lisa Holland, and we're both with the Center on Transition Innovations at VCU. Today we'll be sharing some of our tips and suggestions for getting that really valuable information so that you can build on it through this Discovering Me person-centered planning process. Just a note, appropriate students for Discovering Me, while it's really useful for all students, just in the interest of time and energy, we would suggest that it's used for students who are going to have the greatest barriers to employment and may benefit from customized or supported employment. Some of the outcomes we anticipate from Discovering Me include an increase in parental, student, and educator expectations of the individual's capacity to work and their employment options. Frequently, we work with students who no one thought that they could work, and this definitely increases their expectations and their family's expectations for work. Increasing the student's self-care and independent living skills by building opportunities for them to increase those skills, and increasing students' community life engagement, how they engage with others both in their home and school, but also through their wider community.
Before we get started in the process, we wanted to do just a couple of things. One was to give you some tips for facilitators. This would be those tips for those people who are more or less leading the meetings. These tips actually come from lessons learned. Mm-hmm. We have now been implementing Discovering Me over the course of about 4 or 5 years now. And so we thought we would just share some of those things that we learned to make the meetings more productive and possibly more positive. I do have to tell you that oftentimes we hear people tell us that these are the feel-good meetings, and that really makes us feel good. And we also think because we're creating these environments for the meetings where people feel comfortable and feel safe, then that's another one of the reasons why we have so many parents and so many team members who continue to come back throughout the entire process.
Definitely.
But just a couple of tips. Number one is to be respectful to all. That includes your body language, what you say, what you don't say. One of the things that I think that we have to be careful of is we're all so connected now to our technology and things of this nature. Make sure that when you're in the meeting that you're there in the meeting. Don't be texting during the meeting. Don't be on your computer answering emails and things of that nature. Again, create a safety zone environment, for everyone who's in the meeting. That includes, making a commitment to everyone who's in the meeting that what we discuss in the meeting, because sometimes it could be some very private, information, stays within that team. It isn't something that we go out and we talk about, to people who are in the larger community or in the larger school. Listen more, talk less. That is a really tough thing for a lot of us, including me, but again, I think that's part of the reason why especially parents tend to love the Discovering Me process and meetings, because they really do feel like we're listening to them and that they're validated. Their opinions matter. What they have to say is valuable to that overall what we're doing with their child and things of this nature. So again, make sure you remember as a facilitator, you start the conversations, especially when we're talking about this first meeting, okay? But then you take a back seat and let other people do more of the talking. Create a climate that best meets the needs of the individual student. You're going to have a wide range of students probably that you're working with. What works for one student won't necessarily work for other students. So just as a professional, you decide what that may be. It may be that, you have a young person who needs a little bit of movement, so every 10 or 15 minutes we build in where that kid can get up and walk around. There's different things that we can do to set up that climate and make sure that you are doing it. I just want to add in a little caveat here, and Kendel will talk about this a little bit more, but one of our non-negotiables, if you will, is that the student always must be in attendance at the meetings. Please trust us when we say that even for those kids that you think won't be able to participate in the meetings, Number one, we're going to give you some tips, but number two, what we found over the years is that there's a big difference between that student in meeting 1 and meeting 3 in the process. And so we really encourage you just to try to keep working on that climate to make that kid and his family feel comfortable. Again, just kind of a quick little snapshot of what this first meeting kind of is all about. As Kendel said earlier, it's about collecting information. As a facilitator, it's important for you to have a concept of what the purpose of the meeting is and what types of information it is that you're going to need to collect. At the end of this meeting, this is what you as a facilitator is looking for. And again, we call this our foundation information, but really what we're trying to collect out of this meeting is strengths, contributions a student makes, interests that they have, conditions for success, and challenges. Strengths is pretty self-explanatory, what they're good at. Contributions, we're looking so much of what we talk about when we're discussing students with disabilities is how others can contribute to their success. In other words, what parents are doing for their child, what teachers are doing for their child, what paraprofessionals will do, what adult agencies will provide or do for that child. We've got to have that paradigm shift, and we really do need to start thinking about what is it that that child can do for others? How do they contribute, especially to their home, school, and community? So that's part of what we're looking for as well. Interest, of course, is pretty self-explanatory. Interest are those things that you do when you're not told what to do. You know, when you have your free time and things of this nature, the things that you gravitate toward. Conditions for success. Again, here we're looking for what is it, how can we create environments that are going to make that young person more successful? And then, of course, we're also looking to what are the challenges. If we ignore the challenges, then we're going to set that young person up for success. Some of our sources of information, our main source of information really, especially in this first meeting, is that team interview, okay? In addition, though, some other sources of information are observations that are going to be done, you know, outside of the team meetings. What we call additional interviews, those people who couldn't be at the meeting that we also want to get information from because they know the student really well. And then, of course, just a review of records, past transitional assessments, you know, and other sources of more traditional, I guess we would say, school-based assessments. One of the things, though, is beware of these of the accuracy sometimes of these assessments. For those kids often who have the most challenging barriers to employment, they don't always do well on those paper, pencil, multiple choice type of assessments. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons oftentimes where we're using this assessment and this planning process, because many of those more traditional assessments aren't accurate.
So what happens in meeting 1? The first step in the discovering process is the collecting of information. This first phase is going to take about 2 hours because we're going to be collecting a lot of information from families and teachers and agency representatives. And our focus is going to be learning more about the students' strengths and contributions, interests, conditions for success, and challenges, some of those things that Lisa's already commented on. Our activities will start off with an introduction of the team. We want everyone to feel comfortable and acknowledged, so we start off with that introduction. We review the Discovering Me purpose and process, and so everyone knows what to expect. We spend the bulk of the time interviewing the student and the family and the rest of the team. And then at the end, we determine those next steps, what's going to happen next, and what do we need to plan for. Some important considerations before we get started and before the meeting begins. First and foremost, and Lisa has emphasized this and we'll say it again, the student, the family, school representatives must be present for all the Discovering Me meetings. Certainly include agency representatives when it's appropriate and when they're involved or when you want to add some additional information about those services for the family to have. We also want the atmosphere of the meeting to be one where everyone feels comfortable. Lisa's commented on that a little bit, but we certainly want it to be a place where there are no judgments. Oftentimes, especially students and families come into school feeling a little uncomfortable already, and And we want them to know that this is a judgment-free zone with anything that they're going to share. And by the same context, we want the educators to feel like they can share things that happen in the classroom or they see throughout the school without their feeling like there will be any judgment. Making adjustments and meeting the needs of the student and the family. And we'll talk some more about how students can be more involved with the process in their own way so that they feel more comfortable and feel more valued and being able to contribute in their own way. And then we also want to make sure that everyone shares. That's just so, we want all of that information, and it's just really important that everyone is able to feel as if they have a voice in the process. Just a few ways that students can feel more involved and feel more comfortable, letting them sit next to the person that they want to sit next to, maybe having some food and snacks, letting them get up and walk around, as Lisa's already said, but also giving other team members an opportunity to take a little break if they need to. So those are just a few ways to make people feel more comfortable.
When we actually start the meeting itself, okay, we start off with introducing the team and reviewing the agenda. We really do recommend that all team members introduce themselves with one caveat, and that's if the student does the introductions. But really and truly, if they're not, then we want each person to to introduce themselves and then to say how it is that I am either related to this child or what kind of relationship it is that I have with this child. Kendel, my colleague here, is wonderful on remembering names. I happen to be one of those people who is horrible with names. So one of the other tips that I would provide to facilitators is, if possible, have name tags. Because it's a lot of new information sometimes and new people for these team members. One of the other reasons why we really want to have team members introduce themselves is, again, we're trying to build that collaborative and that safe environment. Having people introduce themselves puts everyone on equal ground in terms of that. After everyone introduces themselves, the facilitator simply welcomes. That really does thank everyone for going on this journey with them. Okay, and then simply reviews real quickly the focus of the meeting agenda. We're going to do this, and this. Okay? After we've reviewed that agenda, then we start with introducing Discovering Me. We really want to just talk to everyone on the team, if they're not already familiar, which most people won't be, with this process and why it's important. Oftentimes what Kendel and I do is we talk about what are some of those disappointing adult outcomes, especially around employment and community participation for adults with disabilities. We've got to remember, especially for the parents, and again, this process is for middle and high school kids. Oftentimes, many of those families are just trying to survive the day. It's hard for them to think about when their child's going to be leaving the school system and transitioning into the adult world. But it's really important for us to help them to begin thinking about that process. We also talk simply about how parents can support the process. And we really want to emphasize two things. One is parents can support it by being at the meetings and participating. The other really important thing is that parents do the follow-through. Again, we're going to start building opportunities in the home, school, and community where everyone has different responsibilities. In order for the children to be successful, the parents have to do their part in terms of following through with what is developed within the home. We also talk about why it's important to begin the process early. And we talk really a lot about how the young person that we're seeing here at 13, 14, 15, 8, 17 isn't the same person they're going to be when they're 20 or 25. But if we want to help that person to reach their fullest potential, then we know that there are skills that they're going to have to develop in order to do that. For our kids without disabilities, it's kind of assumed that they will grow up after graduating from high school or college or whatever. They'll either enter college or they'll enter the work field. It's not always true for our kids with disabilities. And we really do have to, again, help people to start thinking about work is going to be an option for everyone. We talk about the importance of collaboration. Again, oftentimes teachers feel like they're doing it alone. Parents feel like they're doing everything alone. Adult agencies feel like they're doing everything alone. And we really do emphasize the fact that we're going to be stronger and better if we collaborate rather than if we individually work in silos. And finally, before we begin, we go any further, we ask people to just say, are you committed to going into this journey with us? You know, does this sound like something that's going to fit your student and your family, you know, and just ask for that commitment.
So conducting the team interview and interviewing those who know me. We have it broken up into 4 sections, and those 4 sections are my family, my school experiences, my community experiences and friends, and additional considerations for my employment. This indicates just how strong we have that commitment towards really looking at the student through their home, school and community. This is the bulk of this first part of the process, is this interview. And really, we call it an interview, but we'd really like for it to be a situation where everyone feels comfortable and it's a conversation. It's something that's flowing. It's something that includes everybody who's at the table. And that's why we spend so much time talking about that climate and people feeling comfortable. Yeah. To give you an idea of some of those questions that are asked, here are a few sample prompts. We have home is often one of the first places we learn about working and having responsibilities. Tell us some of the things your child does around the home to help him or herself or others. This could be as simple as making the bed or as complex as fixing meals for the entire family. It's one of our longer prompts, longer and more complex questions. We also have describe some of the least successful times your child had in school. What do you think contributed to these challenges? This one's a little bit shorter, a little simpler. What we would suggest is that you vary those questions as you're asking them. Each question on the interview form will have a longer, more complex question, or a version of that question, and a shorter, simpler version of that question. It makes, I think it flows a little bit better. It makes for a better conversation if we're not using all short ones where it feels sort of like an interrogation, or all long ones where I think people get a little bit lost in the conversation. We also include some clarifying questions because sometimes it's just hard to get information that you're seeking from families and from other teachers and from those community agency reps. So we have some clarifying questions. Those might include, what are your child's preferred activities at home? Why do you think he or she likes these activities? And really what we're looking for is you've asked that first, or you posed that first version of a question, but you didn't quite get what you were looking for. For example, sometimes we find that with one of the first questions we ask, it involves routines at home. And we'll ask the question about routines, and oftentimes we might get, well, I get up in the morning and I go to school. So then we look at those clarifying questions, because there's not a lot of information there when we get that question. So then we'll ask some clarifying questions. What's the first thing you do when you get up in the morning? And then how much help do you get with that activity? Do you need help brushing your teeth? Do you need assistance getting on the bus or with a car driver? These are really the who, what, where, when, why questions that we ask when we're clarifying that gives us a little more detail. And then the interview is over and we start planning for the next meeting. The first thing we do is we review. Is there anything that we would like to review between this phase of the process and our second phase of the process? Are there any transition assessments that we'd like to look at? Or was there information from maybe a past triennial review that we would like for the team to be able to review? Are there others who weren't at the meeting that we would like to interview? Sometimes it's grandparents who are in Florida for the winter. Could we call them and maybe interview them by phone? Just anybody else who knows the student really well that we'd like information from. Are there observations that we'd like to conduct? Maybe they're already in a work type of situation or a pre-employment situation that we'd like to get an observation. Frequently, what our suggestion will be is that the person who does that observation is someone who's not as familiar with the student. We also expand invitations. Is there somebody else who has good information that we'd like to have at the next meeting? Sometimes that's a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, somebody who might have some really good information that we don't know a lot about. And then we specify any other steps that we'd like to take. Is there anything else that we would like the team to engage in before the next meeting?
Then we have, after that, the meeting ends, okay, the formal meeting ends, but then we have our quote-unquote to-do list. These are the things that you're going to do in between the first meeting and the second meeting. Part of that is based on what we identified through that review process, okay? Other interviews to do, observations to conduct, etc. The other huge thing, though, that we have to do in between the first meeting and before the second meeting is to compile and record that information from that interview and from any other sources that we have at that point in time on what we call foundational information. You remember I said at the beginning it's important to know, we're looking for strengths, contributions the student makes, interests, conditions for success, and challenges. Okay, so we have to compile all of those things in preparation for the next meeting. As we said earlier, we have learned a lot of lessons in the 4 or 5 years that we've been conducting this process. One of the lessons that we've learned is we need to get to do better at involving students and preparing students for the meetings. So just 3 tips for how we could maybe involve or how you could involve students in this first meeting. Number 1, have them introduce the team members or participants, okay? Or have them make name badges for that person before the meeting begins. Remember though, whenever we're talking about involving students, make sure you prepare them, make sure they're comfortable, okay, before we do it. Like for example, we ask a student to go in and we haven't prepared them, and there's somebody at the table that they don't know, which could very possibly happen, okay? That's unfair to the student. We want to make sure, okay, that we prepare them. Make sure that they're participating in the team conversation, and you can do that through, either directly asking for input, like Michael, tell us what your day looks like before you come to school, okay? Or you can ask students to validate information provided by another person. Michael, do you agree with what your mom just said, okay? But every once in a while as a facilitator, make sure, if you're not hearing the student's voice a lot, then you make sure that you're actively seeking that. And again, another way is just to assist the student with tasks, such as, housekeeping, what we call housekeeping tasks, handing out papers, directing people to where the restroom is while they're in the building, and things of that nature. So 3 simple little tips on how you can involve students. This ends our first short little webcast on this process of collecting information for the Discovering Me assessment and transitional planning. If you want additional information, please feel free to visit our website at www.centerontransition.org. Okay, or you see our email addresses up there. If you want to, please feel free to email us. Thank you for joining us.